She was 19 years old, and she had $2 folded in the pocket of a dress that no longer fit her the way it had a year ago. Her name was Cora Whitfield, and on the morning this story begins, she had been sleeping 4 nights in the loft of a livery stable in Ash Fork, Wyoming Territory, because her uncle had told her, plainly and without raising his voice, that there was no longer a place for her under his roof. He was a man named Harlan Depew, her mother's brother, and he kept the accounts for the Ash Fork Cattle Company. And he liked to say that a household was a ledger like any other, and that a line which took in more than it gave out had to be struck. Cora had been that line. She had come to him 2 years before, when the fever took both her parents in the same hard week, and she had come with nothing but a canvas sack of clothing, and the one thing her father had pressed into her hands before the end. Her father had been a railroad man, not an owner, not a man with his name on any paper that mattered, but a car inspector for the Union Pacific, a man who had spent 30 years walking the length of trains with a lantern and a hammer, listening to the ring of iron, reading the health of a thing by the sound it made. He had taught her that. He had taught her to swing the inspector's hammer he carried, a short ash-handled tool with a worn steel head, and to know a sound bolt from a cracked one, a true weld from a false one, by the note it gave back. When he died, he left her the hammer. It was the only inheritance she had, and her uncle had laughed at it. A girl with a hammer, Harlan Depew had said, there's a fortune. She kept it wrapped in a square of oilcloth at the bottom of her sack, and she took it out sometimes at night in the livery loft, and held it, because it was warm in her hand, the way a hand remembers another hand. The 2 years in her uncle's house had been 2 years of being made small. Harlan Depew did not beat her, and he did not starve her, and he would have been offended to be told he had been cruel. He simply made it plain, in 100 quiet daily ways, that she was a cost he was carrying and not a person he was keeping. He counted the food she ate. He remarked on the wood she burned. When she mended the neighbor's clothes for a few coins of her own, he told her the coins should come to the house, since the house fed the hands that earned them. She had learned to be quiet in that house and to make herself take up as little room as a person can, and she had learned that a man who thinks of everything as a number will, in the end, think of you as one too. The morning he told her to go, he did not even look up from his accounts. He said there was no place for her, and he wet the tip of his pencil and he went on adding a column of figures, and that was the whole of it. She had walked out with her canvas sack and her father's hammer and stood in the road, and the thing she felt was not grief, so much as a strange, cold clarity, as though a fog had lifted. She was alone now, entirely, and being entirely alone is a terror, but it is also, she would learn, a kind of freedom. No one was keeping her ledger any more but herself. The morning it began, she had gone down to the rail yard because the rail yard was the one place in Ash Fork that felt like something her father would have known. The Union Pacific ran a spur line through the town, and off that spur, on a length of dead track that curved behind the water tower and ended in a stand of cottonwoods, sat a row of cars that the company had abandoned in place. There were 3 of them. 2 were rotted through, their roofs fallen in, their sides gaping. But the 3rd was a boxcar, and though its red paint had gone to the color of dried blood and its wheels had rusted to the rails, it stood square and whole, and its great sliding door had been welded shut. Cora stood looking at it for a long time. She walked the length of the dead track slowly, the frost crunching under her boots, and she looked at the 3 cars the way her father would have looked at them. The 2 rotted ones she passed by. There was nothing in a car you could see straight through, but the welded boxcar stopped her. It sat lower on its springs than an empty car ought to, she thought, though she could not have said, that first morning, how she knew it. It had the settled, patient weight of a thing that was carrying something. She stood with her hand flat against the cold iron of its side, and she felt, faintly, the way you feel a heartbeat through a wall. Nothing at all, and yet something, and she could not have told you why she did not walk away. There was a man at the yard office that morning, a company clerk named Pettibone, who had come out from Cheyenne to settle the accounts of the closed spur, and he was a bored man with a list, and when Cora asked him about the welded car, he was glad enough to have someone to talk to. He told her the car had sat on that dead track for near 30 years. He told her nobody rightly knew what was in it, only that it had been sealed by the order of a yardmaster long dead, and that the company had written it off decades ago as scrap. It wasn't worth the labor to haul. He told her the door had been welded, not locked, which meant no key existed and no key ever would, and that the seam had held so long that the men who might have cut it open had all moved on or died. Companies selling off the dead stock, Pettibone said, rails, ties, the scrap cars. $2 takes the welded one. If you want a rusted box you can't even open. Nobody's fool enough to bid on a car sealed shut. Could be empty. Could be full of nothing but 30 years of dark. Cora Whitfield took the $2 from her pocket. It was everything she had in the world. "I'll take it," she said. Pettibone looked at her the way people look at someone about to do a foolish thing, and then he shrugged, because it was not his money and not his life, and he wrote her name in his list and took her $2 and gave her a paper that said, "The welded boxcar on the dead spur behind the water tower was, in the eyes of the Union Pacific Railroad, the lawful property of Cora Whitfield. And with that, she was penniless, and she owned a car she could not open, and the whole of Ash Fork, when it heard of it by supper, laughed the way her uncle had laughed. But what nobody in Ash Fork knew, what Cora herself could not have imagined, was that behind that welded door, bolted down in the dark for 30 years, was a thing that would not only lift her out of the livery loft, but would unmake the man who had cast her out, and give back to a broken town something it had long ago given up as lost. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Cora Whitfield and the railroad car no one could open. And if you find yourself drawn into her story tonight, take a moment to subscribe and light a lantern with us and tell us in the comments what corner of the country you're watching from. We're always glad to know who's out there in the dark with us. The first night, she slept in the cottonwoods beside the car, wrapped in her one blanket because she owned the ground it stood on now, or near enough, and because she had nowhere else. She lay looking up at the great dark shape of it against the stars, and she listened to it. That was the thing her father had taught her that no one else understood. A thing that has stood a long while has a voice. The wind moved through the rotted cars down the line and made them moan, but the welded car was silent, and its silence was the silence of a thing packed full and holding. She remembered, lying there, the way her father had taught her the work. He would take her out along the sidings on a Sunday when the yard was quiet, and he would put the hammer in her small hand and fold his own rough hand over it, and he would tap a wheel and say, "Listen." A sound wheel sang, a clear, bright ring that hung in the air. A cracked one gave back a dull, dead knock, a sound with no life in it, and a man who knew that difference could keep a whole train from leaving the rails. "It is all in the listening, girl," he would tell her. "Anybody can look. Looking is easy, and looking lies, but a thing cannot lie about the sound it makes when you strike it true." She had been 7 years old, and 8 and 10, learning the notes of iron beside him, and she had not understood then that he was teaching her the only thing she would ever truly own. In the morning, she took out the hammer. She did not try to force the door. She knew better than that, and besides, the welded seam was a finger thick, and no hammer would touch it. Instead, she walked the length of the car the way her father had walked 10,000 trains, and she struck it softly every foot or so, and she put her ear to the iron and listened to what came back. Along most of its length, the note was flat and dead, the sound of a solid wall. But near the far end, low, below the sill line where the frame met the floor, the note changed. It rang. There was a hollow there, and where there is a hollow in a thing that is meant to be solid, there is a reason. It took her 2 days to understand what she was hearing. The floor of the boxcar was not one floor, it was 2. Somewhere in the ceiling of it, someone had built a false floor above the true one, and the space between rang hollow, and whatever the car had been sealed to hide had not been left loose in the body of it where anyone cutting the door might find it. It had been laid in the floor, beneath the boards, in the last place a scrapper's torch would ever look. She could not reach it through the door. But a boxcar has more than a door. At the end of the car, below the sill, there was an inspection hatch, a small iron plate her father had shown her the like of 100 times, meant for a man to check the trucks and the under frame. It too had rusted, but rust is not weld, and rust answers to patience and to oil and to the steady tapping of a hammer that knows exactly where a seized bolt has its weakness. For 3 days, Cora worked at that hatch, tapping and oiling with a can of axle grease she begged from the livery, working the 4 corroded bolts a quarter turn at a time. You did not fight a seized bolt. Her father had taught her that too. You did not throw your weight against it and strip it and ruin it. You woke it slowly. You worked the oil in, and you tapped the head to shiver the rust loose in the threads, and you gave it a quarter turn, and then you let it be, and you came back, and you gave it another. A seized bolt was a stubborn thing and not a strong one, and stubbornness gives way to patience every time if the patience is real. On the 2nd day, a boy from the town came and watched her from a distance, a skinny, tow-headed boy of 10 or so, and when he saw she meant him no harm, he came closer and asked what she was doing under a broke old car. She told him she was opening it. He told her his pa said the car couldn't be opened, that it was welded shut by ghosts, that everybody knew. She said there were no ghosts, only bolts, and a bolt was just a problem that hadn't been listened to right yet. The boy thought about that, and then he sat down in the frost to watch. And he came back the next day too, and it was the boy, in the end, who would run into town shouting when the thing was found, though neither of them knew that yet. On the evening of the 3rd day, the last bolt gave with a groan, and the plate swung down, and she was looking up into the underbelly of the car and the raw underside of the false floor. She went home to the cottonwoods that night, and she did not sleep, and in the morning she crawled up into the dark with her hammer and her father's memory and a candle stub, and she began to pry up the false floor from below. The boards came away one by one, and in the space between the 2 floors, wrapped in waxed canvas gone brittle with the years, laid in careful rows like a thing that mattered to whoever had hidden it, was the reason the car had been welded shut. It was money, but it was more than money. There were strong boxes, 4 of them, iron and heavy, and when she worked one open with the claw of her hammer, gold coins spilled into her candlelight, double eagles by the 100, more money than Cora Whitfield had ever imagined in one place. But she did not, in that first moment, understand what she truly held. It was only when she found the ledger, wrapped separate in its own oilcloth, that the story began to come clear, and the story was worth more than the gold. The ledger belonged to the Ash Fork Miners and Drovers Bank, and Cora, who could read a column of figures because her father's daughter had a head for such things, sat in the dark under the car for a long while, turning the pages, and understood by degrees that she was holding the answer to a wound the town of Ash Fork had carried for 30 years. To understand what she held, you have to understand what had happened to Ash Fork. 30 years before, the town had been twice the size it was now. It had a bank, the Miners and Drovers, and into that bank the whole of the valley had put its savings, the miners their wages, the drovers their season's pay, the homesteaders the slow gathering of years. And then, in a single autumn, the bank had failed. The story that had come down was that a shipment of the bank's reserves, the gold that backed every account in the valley, had been loaded aboard a Union Pacific car to be moved to Cheyenne for safekeeping ahead of a hard winter, and that the car had been robbed on the spur, the gold taken, the guard killed, and the bank left hollow. Every family in Ash Fork had lost what it had. Farms went under. Half the town packed and left. The valley never recovered, and the wound of it had passed down to children who had not yet been born when it happened, but who had grown up poor in the shadow of it all the same. But the ledger told another story. There had been no robbery. Cora read it in the careful, damning hand of a man named Josiah Crane, who had been the yardmaster of the Ash Fork Spur, and who had written it all down because he had meant, one day, to set it right, and had died before he could. The bank's own directors had staged the robbery. They had loaded the gold, welded it into the floor of a boxcar left standing on a dead spur where no one would think to look, and put out the story of a killing on the line. They had meant to let the town believe its money stolen, to let the bank fail, to buy up the ruined farms for pennies through men who did not seem to be them, and then, when the years had passed and the story had gone cold, to quietly recover the gold from the sealed car and be rich twice over, once on the stolen savings, once on the stolen land. And the man whose name appeared again and again in Josiah Crane's ledger, the man who had kept the books of the false robbery, the young clerk who had drawn up the papers that turned a whole valley's grief into one family's fortune, was Harlan Depew. Cora sat very still under the car with the candle guttering. Her uncle, the man who had struck her from his ledger like a bad debt. He had been a young man of the bank 30 years ago, and he had helped to bury this gold, and he had spent the 30 years since as the respectable keeper of accounts for the very cattle company that had grown fat on the land the bank's failure had made cheap. He had waited. She understood now. Josiah Crane had died before the gold could be quietly lifted, and the secret of exactly which car, on which dead spur, had died with him. For Crane, at the last, had not trusted his fellows, and had welded the car himself and told no one the whole of it, meaning to expose them all. The gold had sat there 30 years because the men who hid it no longer knew for certain where it was, and dared not be seen searching. And her uncle had watched that rail yard his whole life, waiting for a certainty that never came. And a girl with a hammer had found it in 9 days. Now, Cora Whitfield was 19 and she was alone, and she was holding a fortune in gold and a ledger that named the most powerful men in the county as thieves and worse. A lesser person might have taken the gold and run. It would have been the easy thing, and no one would ever have known. But her father had not raised an easy person. He had raised a girl who believed that a true thing and a false thing gave off different sounds, and that a person's whole worth lay in knowing the difference and standing by it. She did not run. Instead, she did a careful, patient, dangerous thing. She left the gold where it was in the floor of the car, and she welded the false floor back down as near as she could, and she told no one what she had found. But she took the ledger, Josiah Crane's ledger, and she copied it out by hand, every page, by candlelight over 4 long nights, and she hid the copy where no one would think to look. And then she went to the one man in the county she judged might be honest and might be beyond her uncle's reach. The federal land agent, a graying, careful man named Amos Reed, who had come out from Washington to sort the old land claims of the valley, and who owed nothing to anyone in Ash Fork. It was a slow thing, justice. It did not come in a single hour. Cora went to Amos Reed, and she laid out what she had found. And at first he did not believe her, for who would believe such a thing from a penniless girl living in a livery loft? But she had the ledger, and Amos Reed had spent his life reading the difference between a true document and a forged one. And he knew Josiah Crane's hand from other papers of the old bank, and as he read, he grew very quiet and then very still, the way a man goes still when the floor of the world shifts under him. "You understand what this is," he said to her. "I understand it's the truth," Cora said, "and the truth's owed to this town." "If we move too soon," Amos Reed told her over the lamp in his small office, the ledger open between them, "your uncle and the men with him will hear of it, and gold is easy to move in a night, and paper is easy to burn. We have one chance to do this, and we must do it whole. You have carried this alone this far. Can you carry it a while longer, and say nothing, and let no one see it on your face?" "I lived 2 years in that man's house and said nothing," Cora told him. "I can wait." They moved carefully after that, the two of them. Amos Reed sent for a federal marshal, quietly, a man from outside the territory named Deakins who owed no debts in Ash Fork and could not be bought by men who had bought everyone else. He gathered the old records of the bank's failure, the yellowed newspaper accounts of the robbery that never was, the deeds by which the ruined farms had passed for pennies to a chain of buyers that seemed unconnected and, traced back through Crane's ledger, all led to the same 3 men. He set them beside Crane's ledger and found where they matched and where the official story had been made to lie. It was slow, close work, the work of reading, and Cora sat across the lamp from him through many long evenings and read alongside him, for she had her father's patience and her father's ear for a false note. And more than once, it was she who saw where a date had been changed, or a name stood where it should not. And when it was all in order, when the case was iron, they went to the sealed car with the marshal and a company of witnesses, and Cora Whitfield crawled up into the dark one last time and brought down into the daylight the strong boxes of gold that 30 years of grief had been built upon. Word had gone out somehow, the way word does in a small place, and the town of Ash Fork came out to the rail yard that day. They came on foot and in wagons, the old ones who remembered the year the bank failed, and the young ones who had only grown up hearing of it, and they stood in the cold sun in a great, uneasy crowd along the dead track. There was the boy who had watched her work, up near the front, near bursting with the importance of having been there first. There were men who had laughed at her in the saloon a month before, standing now with their hats in their hands. They watched the marshal's men crawl up under the car, and they watched the strong boxes come down one by one into the light. 4 of them, heavy as sin. And when the first lid was thrown back and the gold caught the sun, a sound went through the crowd. There was not quite a cheer and not quite a sob, but something older than both. And then Amos Reed stood up on the sill of the open car with Josiah Crane's ledger in his hands, and he read it aloud, in his careful federal voice, the whole cold arithmetic of it, and they heard the ledger read out, and they learned, all in 1 hour, that their fathers had not been robbed by outlaws, but by the men who had sat in the front pews and bought their farms and shaken their hands for 30 years. And they turned, as one, to look at Harlan Depew, who had come to the yard like everyone else, and who stood now with his face the color of old ash, understanding that the niece he had thrown into the street had opened the one door in the world he had spent his life unable to open. He did not run either. There was nowhere to run to. The marshal took him, and the 2 other directors still living, and the courts did the rest, slow and certain, and the ledger Cora Whitfield had found held up under every challenge, because a true thing rings true no matter how you strike it. The gold was returned. Not to the bank, which was long dead, but to the valley, parceled back by Amos Reed and the federal court to the descendants of every family that had lost their savings in the false robbery, tracked down one by one through the bank's old accounts, which Cora herself helped to read, for she had a head for figures and a patience for the work. Old debts were paid. Farms that had been lost were bought back. A town that had been dying for 30 years drew a breath and began, slowly, to live again. And Cora Whitfield, who might have kept it all, took only what the court ruled was fairly hers under the law of salvage, and finding a portion, enough more than a girl from a livery loft could have dreamed, but a small thing beside what she gave back. She did not want a fortune built on the grief of the valley. She had seen what that did to a man like her uncle. She bought back her father's name a different way. With her portion, she did not leave Ash Fork. She stayed. She bought the old rail yard, the dead spur, and the water tower and the stand of cottonwoods, and she made of it a going concern again. a freight and repair yard, for the railroad still ran its spur through the town, and a yard needs someone who can read the health of a car by the sound it makes. She hired the men the failed years had left idle. She kept her father's hammer on a nail by the door of the yard office where she could see it every day. And the welded car, the boxcar that no one could open, she did not scrap. She had it cleaned and mended and set on a length of good track by the office, and she kept it as it was, empty now, its false floor gone, its great door, which she finally had cut open on her own terms in her own time, standing wide to the light. People came to see it in the years after. Children climbed in it. It became a thing the town told its visitors about, the car that had held the truth for 30 years and given it up at last to a girl with a hammer. Harlan Depew died in a territorial prison, and Cora did not go to the burying, but she did not speak ill of him either. She had learned something about the difference between a person and a debt. Her uncle had spent his whole life treating people as lines in a ledger to be struck when they cost more than they gave. And the lesson of his ruin, the thing Cora carried out of it, was that no person is ever only what they cost you. Her father had been a car inspector with a hammer and $30 a month to his name, and her uncle had called that nothing. But her father had left her the one thing that opened the door that all her uncle's cunning never could. He had left her the knowing of true from false, and that had been worth a valley's fortune. Cora Whitfield lived a long life in Ash Fork. She married, in time, a man who worked her yard, a quiet man who understood about the sounds that things make, and she raised children who grew up climbing in an old red boxcar and never knowing a hungry year. And when she was old, and the young ones asked her how it had all begun, she would tell them the truth, which was the only thing she had ever traded in. She had been 19 years old and homeless, and she had $2 to her name, and she had spent them on a railroad car that everyone said could not be opened and was surely empty. It was the best $2 she ever spent. There is a thing worth carrying out of a story like this one, and it is not about gold, for the gold was never really the point. It is that the world is full of things that other people have written off, sealed up, welded shut, called empty, struck from the ledger as not worth the labor, and the whole of a life can turn on whether you have the patience to walk the length of such a thing and listen softly for the place where it rings hollow. What everyone else calls worthless is only so often a thing whose true sound no one has troubled to hear. So we'll leave you tonight with a question, and we do read every answer. What is something in your own life that others overlooked or called worthless that turned out to hold more than anyone knew? Tell us in the comments below. Light a lantern with us, subscribe if this story kept you company tonight, and we'll see you down the line, where the next story is already waiting in the dark.